Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 18th of August, 2024, and you join us today with a live stream that will examine the imperialist way of war, or more to the point, that the way of war that has been commonplace since around about the year 2000 or slightly afterwards, and how the imperialists are unable to adapt, and how this leads them into the dead end that they are now in Ukraine. So we will be talking about that over the course of the next hour or so. So what has prompted me to do this is the ongoing discussion regarding the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk region, and the need to address this. So what I'll be doing is just going through some comments on this, and then talking specifically about what this latest incursion can tell us about the way imperialism wages war, and also the way it would wage war against China as well. See, first of all, though, it's important just to set some background here. So when I talk about the Kursk incursion, what do I mean? I mean that on August 6th this year, the Ukrainian armed forces, under the direction of NATO officers, in a plan that we must assume was designed by principally US and British officers, launched an attack into the Kursk region of the Russian Federation. This was not actually the total surprise to the Russians that it has been portrayed as by like the NAFO bots, etc., and the Russian Dumas, about whom more later. Now, the Russians have been actually launching missions into the neighboring Sumy region of Ukraine in late July, trying to find out why the Ukrainians were assembling forces there. What the Ukrainians did, though, was deploy rapid mobile warfare tactics, and this appeared to, or was allowed to, catch the Russians out. They have, over the past couple of weeks now, taken, according to some estimates, 30 villages in the Kursk region. As I said, this is based on rapidly moving armored columns, often with rather light armored vehicles, but with some tanks as well, including apparently the much vaunted British Challenger 2 tank. And they moved fast, often down unguarded or lightly guarded roads. So there was some major casualty events on the Russian side, including an attack on one Russian military column by a HIMARS launcher that, HIMARS rockets that killed up to around about 50 Russian personnel. So the other thing to note is that the promised training of local militias in the border region did appear to have some impact. So if you recall, a while back when the Ukrainians were launching these raids over into Belgorod that were principally staffed by Russian fascists. So all of those Russian fascist organizations that were quite big about 15 years ago, an awful lot of them ended up in Ukraine fighting for the American imperialists, proving that for the bulk of Russian fascist organizations, these still remain wholly compradors. So this was portrayed, of course, as the great military success of Ukraine. Again, what the exact nature of the advance will turn out to be will only become clear with time. Whether the Russian high command had some plan to allow them to advance, we don't know. But it should be said that they took 30 villages, but they cannot hold these. They can't hold these because they do not have the supply lines in place in order to actually reinforce their position. They don't have the supply lines in place because they don't have control over the air. They don't have control over the ground in terms of the Russian missile coverage and their ability to hit Ukrainian columns that now come in. And the NATO officers again, I think we're principally talking about British and American officers who planned this adventure, will have known very well that they wouldn't have been able to resupply. So what was the aim of the raid? Maximum objectives, shall we say, maximal objectives would have been, I think, to at the least seize the Kursk regional nuclear power facility and stage some kind of act of blackmail on it. That would have been the maximum objective of this, because all of these fast-moving armored columns, reason why they advanced so fast is because they just literally put the accelerator down and just kept on going, and those are the ones who reached the farthest out, and those who ran into significant resistance and were slowed down, including by the trained militia that I mentioned previously. After the raids in the Belgorod region, the Russian government did commit to training civilian militias, and they did in the Kursk region, and these appeared to have had some impact upon the ability of the Ukrainians to advance, where these militias properly mobilized and were able to hold up the Ukrainian columns. But what's happened is in a strange way, it's a mirror of almost an exact reflection of what the Russians did in those early periods of the special military operation, where Russian columns advanced very quickly down to around the Kiev area, often with quite light forces, and then found themselves sometimes cut off, and that's when a lot of prisoners got taken. Same thing is happening now with regard to Ukraine. They've by rapidly driving down unguarded roads or lightly guarded roads, they've run as far as they can into the Kursk region. Now they're slowly getting rounded up. Now they're slowly getting pushed out or annihilated, or they're surrendering. There was never any real chance of Ukraine keeping any of this. As I said, the most they could have aimed for is the seizure of the Kursk nuclear power facility and engaging in some sort of terroristic act of blackmail. Now, that would have been the maximum objective. The other objectives are, of course, to create a slew of positive headlines in principally the American and British and European press. And that's really the objective here. It was never about being able to hold ground inside Russia. The people who designed this aren't that stupid. What it is designed to do is to look like that they could seize ground inside Russia. There is an important distinction to be made between the two. If they were looking to seize ground inside Russia, they would have had to have had a hell of a lot more in terms of forces available to them. What they've done is they've scraped together as many men as they could, and some of their better military vehicles, and have staged this quick raid. And it's going to get wrapped up. They're going to get ejected or killed or captured. And more men of the Ukrainian armed forces who've gone on to this raid are being captured or killed. So that's the bold facts, shall we say. What does it tell us about the objectives? So as I said, the objectives are principally for PR purposes. And again, this isn't a surprise if you understand the way in which this war is being fought. So this has been partially about boosting the image of Zelenskyy. And you can tell who has designed this by looking at Zelensky's statements. When the raid was launched, he said a very curious thing. He said Putin's reign began 24 years ago with an event with the label of Kursk. That refers to, of course, the Kursk submarine sinking all the way back in August of 2000 and August of 2001. No, August 2000, even earlier than that. And so Zelenskyy made that strange speech saying his reign will now end. I won't do the impression. Of course it won't. But it's an interesting way of putting it. It tells me that, of course, Zelenskyy doesn't write his own material. But also, so it was also designed to boost him. His popularity is non-existent inside Ukraine. So if you can attribute a victory, even the appearance of a victory, to Zelenskyy, his handlers hope that will bolster him somehow. And also, they needed a change of narrative. The narrative has been about Ukrainian defeat. It's also been about even the Democrats in the United States starting to realize that this is a losing battle now. And so best thing to do is to try and extricate themselves somehow. Now that they're running Harris rather than Biden, the people handling the Harris campaign, or I should say the Harris-Waltz campaign, have clearly taken some advice to drop this, or should we say minimize this. Now, I am going to come on to why I think that there's multiple factions operating at the moment and that there's nobody clearly in charge on the Western side. And this is part of what is motivating this. But more on that later. So those who are in favor of continuing the war in some form want desperately to change this narrative of defeat, of pullout, of the various different NATO countries deciding that time's up. So a raid into Russia itself makes a lot of sense when you look at it that way. So the other element of this was covered in the Washington Post and the Daily Telegraph recently, and that is a move by, again, those who are most militantly in favor of the continuation of the war to block talks between Russia and Ukraine that were going on in Doha, Qatar, that were supposedly about avoiding targeting of each other's energy facilities. Because if you look at the stories coming out of Ukraine, the targeting of energy facilities has had a very severe impact on both industrial production, of course, and civilian life. So it would make sense if the Ukrainians were looking for a way to try and stop the Russians targeting that. And it would make sense that some in the West would seek to try and make that bargain. Now, again, I don't see why the Russians would make that bargain, given that it's a tactic that is working, given that it's a tactic that is going to put a lot of pressure on Ukrainian frontline, because if the power's failing, then an awful lot of other things start failing as well, including their electronic warfare potentially. So these talks were going on, and this, of course, led some in the Russian information space to accuse the Russian government of capitulationism, of weakness. And again, we'll come back to that Russian information space later and where I think all this comes from. Or should we say the Duma information space? Duma spelled D-O-O-M-E-R, not D-U-M-A. So the biggest motivation here, I think, is the last one, which is to ensure that the war can and that there is no negotiation. And I think that's something which unifies an awful lot, or should we say no official negotiation. There's always unofficial negotiations, as the recent prisoner exchange showed. But there's going to be no acknowledgement of any negotiation. There's going to be no official negotiation over how the war ends. And that's the biggest motivation here, to keep the war going as it currently is for as long as is possible. Keep Ukraine in play. Again, there's never any one single motivation for doing anything, but there are various motivations which are coming together now. There are the ultras in the NATO camp who want to bounce the politicians, who they regard as cowardly, into continuing the war as it is at the current level of support. They're a minority, but they're a powerful minority, and they're very well represented in British intelligence services and the hierarchy of the British military, and in certain aspects of both of the major political parties, both the Labour and the Conservative parties. So they are very well represented in Britain, and I'll come for the specific reasons why in just a moment. But they are allied with the most hardline elements in the United States. Hardline elements in the United States, including those within Senate, which includes people like Lindsey Graham, who, of course, isn't a leader himself. He speaks for this faction. These characters have a very strong presence in the State Department. They have a strong presence within both the Senate, Republicans and Democrats. And they're well represented, of course, within the wider ruling class, particularly those who are involved with, I think, like finance in particular. The tech guys are or some of the tech guys are a little bit less keen on the Ukraine war. They are very keen on the Israel war, though. Important distinction to make. So these various motivations came together to create this. Now, before I get on to the additional details of the things I've just been discussing, just a little bit on what this tells us about the Western way of war. The Western way of war, when it comes to Russia, hasn't changed in the last 30 years. They have been trying this same tactics over and over again, which is, first of all, in that initial period, as I was saying yesterday, after the treacherous collapse of the Soviet Union and the counter-revolution that took place there, you try and use the compradors you more or less control, such as Yeltsin, Gaidar, but oligarchs like Berezovsky, and you use them to try and break up Russia, to remove any conceivable threat that it might pose by destroying it completely. When that doesn't work, you then move to other tactics, or put more emphasis on other tactics. So the imperialists had been essentially running the jihadist operation out of Chechnya for a number of years, headed by various characters, some of whom are now on the battlefield in Ukraine on the NATO side. I think they're referred to as like Ishkarians, is the faction. They were aligned with the deceased Chechen leaders like Dudayev and others. And they were backed by the CIA and MI6 for a number of years. This included the time when they were engaged in terrorist actions, such as the raid on the Moscow theater, such as the Beslan school siege, and other incidents, major armed incursions into the territory of the Russian Federation out of the Caucasus. This was all done with CIA and MI6 backing. So what they're doing with regard to this is nothing new. It's just being done on a bigger scale as part of a full-scale war. So the way in which this is being done is reminiscent of that, reminiscent of what was done in Chechnya, as I've said before. But what it tells us about war is that when it comes to Russia, they have never been confident enough, even back in the 90s or in the early 2000s, to try and stage an outright provocation and start a full-scale war. They didn't do that even during the 90s because principally they thought they were getting what they wanted out of Yeltsin. Then they were prepared to see if Putin was going to shape up to be a comprador. It turned out that he wasn't. And so what they've done since then is adopt consistent hybrid warfare against Russia. Again, never attacking directly themselves, but always being one step removed. So using Ukraine has been the aim for a long, long time. The project there has been running, well, arguably since World War II, but in the modern period since 91. And so the aim of it has always been to turn Ukraine into an outsourced army, an offshored army that can be used for destabilization operations against the Russian Federation. What is the aim of a destabilization operation? It takes it's part of a full-scale sort of hybrid war against the Russian Federation that includes attacks on the economic level, on the cultural level, very important as well, cultural and ideological level, and also, of course, on the military level. Now, in each of these, the hand of the imperialists is there, if for those who are politically astute enough to see it, but always seeking to act through local hires. Remember, they were not confident enough to go and actually take on the Russians directly, even in the bad old days of the later 1990s. They didn't really want to do that. They weren't confident they would win. And so they always act through intermediaries, through proxy forces, Chechens, etc., Dagestanis, others from the Central Asian region, such as those who carried out the bomb attack and gun attack on the Crocus City Hall concert venue, which again has, as far as I can tell, gone rather quiet recently. But the Russians were very much asserting early on that the intelligence services of Ukraine and ultimately the West, mainly Britain and the United States, were having some role in that. Again, I'd need to go back over the case to see how that's turned out. Regardless of that, though, the hybrid war is what was chosen to try and take on Russia. The hybrid war also will be what is used to try and take on China, because, again, they don't want to fight these adversaries directly. They want to do to them, ironically enough, what they always accused the Soviet Union of doing to the United States. If you remember, I played footage of an interview with a bizarre character, a Soviet traitor from the 1980s, named by the name of Yuri Bezmenov, who was a long-time KGB resident in India, who defected to the West. Now, Bezmenov got himself famous with all kinds of extremely online right-wingers to this day. Now, he died a number of years ago, but his famous interview from about 1984 is all about how the Soviets are seeking to hollow out the will to fight of the West. Now, of course, this is exactly what the West intelligence services were doing to the Soviet Union itself, and it's what they've continued to do ever since. So again, as with everything the anti-communists say, take their words and apply it to what they're actually doing. Now, Bezmenov's apparent confession of KGB special measures taken against the imperialists, it reads more like something that the CIA and MI6 and their various arm's length organizations do against the Russian Federation. This is the Western way of war. Now, which is that you seek to penetrate the society using a variety of measures, cultural organizations, educational organizations, NGO human rights operations. This was actually what was done to the Soviet Union, by the way. NGOs, especially human rights NGOs, were a key part of the ideological offensive, which was paired up with the actions of internal collaborators who pressured for concessions to the supposed human rights organizations, things like the Helsinki Accords, which was a disastrous agreement that no halfway sensible Soviet leadership would ever have signed. But there you go. So the actual Bezmenov's confession is more about what the CIA and MI6 were doing, which is hybrid warfare back in the days of the Cold War, which is intensified. So you hollow out the state, ideologically speaking. It helps if you already dominated economically, which they almost did in the 1990s. The compradors gave them their way in. But even after Putin got in, because Putin is at the head of a coalition which includes a lot of ruling class capitalist forces that are pro-US, pro-European especially, pro-German especially, that coalition always had within it compradors. As the Communist Party of the Russian Federation routinely points out, there's always been comprador factions in Putin's coalition. And that's why Zyuganov and others say all the time that the time has come to flush these people out once and for all. And it wasn't Putin who flushed them out. It was, various US presidents who cut these people off from access to the Western financial system. But the aim was to hollow out Russia. If you couldn't quite do it economically speaking, due to the fact that the Putin system did draw certain lines which they didn't want the West to cross, you could do it ideologically. You could hollow out the intellectual layers and bring, or the more correct way of putting that would be to corrupt the intellectual layers in Western Russia in particular, in St. Petersburg and Moscow, have them ideologically converted to comprador points of view, which is, again, what all the educational organizations were doing in Russia. It's what all the cultural organizations were doing there, what the English language teaching bodies were doing there. This was the educational and cultural offensive that was designed to hollow out Russia, ideologically speaking, and to make its intellectual layer into collaborators of the West. That was the attempt that was made. It was a very serious attempt, and it had a lot of resources behind it. That's one aspect of the hybrid war, that cultural, educational, ideological offensive, which is designed to bring as many of the so-called intellectuals of a particular country over to you as possible. Second part of this is, of course, the economic part, which is that you aim to make life as miserable as possible for the working class in a particular country, and also the petty bourgeois, in order that you can then mobilize, first of all, the petty bourgeois, which by its very nature is unstable and often extremely reactionary, and to bring them over to the intellectual leadership exercised by the comprador intellectuals who you've trained. And personification of that effort could perhaps be Alexei Navalny. So this is the other part of it. You increase class tensions within the country concerned, in this case Russia, but you aim principally at the petty bourgeois, and if you can make them scream, and of course the bourgeois itself, then you the hope is that the bourgeois who you bring over to your side can have enough influence, combined with street mobilizations, to carry out a palace coup. You don't really want the working class mobilized as a class, because that opens up risky options for you. You could do with some workers on the street for the purposes of PR. This is what happened in the Maidan in Ukraine. They tried to get workers out on the street by basically threatening them with the sack unless they didn't. It makes for good pictures. And so what you're trying to stage ultimately in Russia, which is what they staged in Ukraine, is a sort of a staged event, a seizure of power, or a coup dressed up as a popular uprising, which is very much under the control of various comprador elements in the existing political structure within the intelligentsia that you have under your control. But everything is done via local hires. It's not done by direct intervention. Any intervention which is made is always covert. You don't have to go too far to trace where the money is coming from, or where the inspiration's coming from, or who's ultimately behind it. The idea is that it at least remains plausibly deniable on BBC or MSNBC or CNN late at night when they do a 5-minute slot on how the evil Putin has been overthrown by democracy-loving protesters who just want to live like we do, etc. So this is your hybrid warfare in action. They hoped that this would win them a result in 2012, and it didn't work. They've hoped that it would get them results ever since then. But how does this connect, I hear you ask, with what is going on in Kursk right now? It's an extension of the same tactics. The hope is that they, by adopting shock tactics like this, by popping up in Kursk, the Ukrainians pop up in the Kursk region, seize a load of villages, seize a load of prisoners, make a load of videos claiming that we're on the road to Moscow, etc., etc., and hope that this destabilizes the Putin government. The reason why that is not working and will not work is because the elements that the imperialists needed in place to have this hybrid warfare technique work, those elements are weakened severely. So the NGO system has been cut off largely in Russia now, though certain elements of it still exist. But the comprador faction is very weak now. No, they're still there, but they've had to shut up. Those members of the Russian capitalist class who opposed the special military operation have had to hide themselves behind a veil of false patriotism now. And so the people you needed to carry out this palace coup aren't there. And so they're trying this same tactic, but again, without the ability to do destabilization operations in Moscow and St. Petersburg at the very least, this isn't happening. So again, this is hybrid warfare that's still being done on a higher level than was done like 10 years ago, but it still comes from the same place. And that place is ultimately a negative one for the imperialists, because they still cannot openly intervene against the Russians. They can't send their armies in because they don't have the capacity to do so. That's why I have very little time for the hysterics in the West who proclaim 10 seconds from World War III every 2 minutes. Of course, I would make the argument that World War III has been in existence since 1991 anyway, so what took you so long to notice? But they don't have the capacity to go in there and fight the Russians themselves. If they could have done that, they would have done that 2 years ago. They can't do it now either. So here we are with the Kursk incursions, and the final point to make here with regard to this hybrid warfare is that this is a tactic which is also used to make sure that the war continues. And again, the Russians were apparently having negotiations in Doha over not targeting each other's energy infrastructure. This was, well, the Washington Post report said that this was something that was being taken seriously. I don't know how seriously we should take that Washington Post report, but these talks were actually in progress. And so now these have been cancelled. There will be no agreement. Now, who wanted that? Many people wanted that. There will be, of course, the Lindsey Graham Lindsey Graham's faction in the United States, but often the most aggressive elements in the United States act in concert with or through their British allies. And so it's most likely to me, looking at this, to be the British officers who have done the most work on this offensive. Because it's really something that the British excel in is dirty tricks, psychological warfare, hybrid warfare stuff. They'll be the ones who are principally behind this, as Kit Clarenberg has reported on many times. I would say, though, we must always remember that their ability to do anything is linked to not just the individual power of the fading British imperialism, but it's linked to their alliance with the most belligerent and aggressive sections of US imperialism, who are smart enough to hide behind their British cutout when they're doing things like this. And so the overall aim now goes beyond just hybrid warfare. The aim is to make sure that there can be no negotiation. So even if things go ahead as they are now, and that the Germans even start to cut off Ukraine from aid, and Harris even basically, laughs and gibbers her way through a presidential campaign whilst permanently drunk and ends up winning anyway because Trump fucked it up, and then slowly withdraws things, and then the media stops covering it, and they get ready to try and do the same thing in China. So this is the aim of this is to make sure that there can be absolutely no possibility of any negotiation, that the Kiev regime can't get tempted into signing agreements with the Russians, that it absolutely has to keep fighting, and that Zelenskyy absolutely has to keep the war going, because otherwise he's fucked. And so the aim is ultimately to force the Russians to carry on the war, to cost them as much as possible. They know that they've lost, but they have to carry on the war. So we're going to see more things like the Kursk incursions. We're going to see more aggressive attacks into Russian territory. We're going to see more missile launches at Russian key energy and military facilities. And this will just carry on, because this is the only move they've got left now. The ultimate aim, as I said, is to keep the war going as long as they possibly can. If it all falls apart, if the Ukrainian government falls apart, which ultimately it will, then the Americans will stick a Ukrainian government in exile and say that this is the real government. What they want to do, what the most aggressive sections in the US and Britain want to do, is to make the Russians have to carry out a conquest of places like Kiev, carry out conquests of as much of Ukraine as possible. So if they can't reach their objectives, their aim now is to make sure that the Russians pay as much as possible in terms of blood and treasure for taking as much of Ukraine as possible. That's the idea now. So ultimately, you force the Russians to extend their border all the way up to western Ukraine, hoping then that you can run an insurgency and cost the Russians billions and many thousands of lives. That's the hope. Now, if this seems cynical and cowardly, that's because that's the imperialist way of war now. If the Russians are more Clausewitzian, in terms of Clausewitz's dictum that the purpose of war is to destroy the forces of the enemy and to fatally compromise the enemy's fighting ability to fight a war by destroying the enemy forces, then that is what the Russians have been doing at great length. The British way of war now is to wage this in a purely hybrid fashion. It's to avoid large-scale war production, no matter what they say. They're still avoiding it. It's to avoid large-scale mobilizations. Remember, the British did away with conscription over 60 years ago, and they have no intention of bringing it back. Sunak being given that policy was basically a suicide pass from the Conservative Party. There was no way that was ever going to be popular. And the British ruling class themselves and their intellectual layers are still pathologically afraid of large-scale working class mobilization, which is what conscription would take. They're terrified of the implications of it, far more than they are losing the war in Ukraine. So it's the same can be said to an extent of the American ruling class. So this cynical move, this is why I've subtitled this episode "To the Last Ukrainian," because that's the policy. That's the way they're going to fight this. Keep it going as long as there's 10 Ukrainians who can be propped up and have guns stuck in their hands, and as long as this version of the Ukrainian state continues to exist, the war will continue. Because this version of the Ukrainian state and its leading personnel have been now completely under the control of the imperialist powers. They have no independent existence whatsoever. Anytime any independent thought is displayed, the imperialists act to make sure it's crushed. So this initiative with regard to the energy systems, how serious it was, I don't know. The fact that the Qataris are involved makes the whole thing very suspicious. I can't see what the Russians would have got out of agreeing to this, unless, of course, the imperialists were dangling the promise of potential sanctions relief on certain Russian energy products, but I can't see them offering that. Who knows? But the fact is, even the fact that the Kiev regime agreed to engage in this negotiation would have been seen by some in the West as too much. So again, you have to make that negotiation impossible. Again, the only aim is to spin things out. The only aim is to keep things going as long as possible. The only aim is to cost the Russians as much as they possibly can. There is no plan to roll into Ukraine itself. There is no plan for NATO to directly intervene, other than in the mind of lunatics like Tobias Ellwood or Boris Johnson, who will never be anywhere near the field of fire. The only plan is to keep Ukrainians dying in horrifically large numbers. So that leaves only two ways this ends. One is that Ukrainians themselves manage to overthrow the Zelenskyy regime. We can but hope that that will happen, but I find it doubtful myself. Or two, the Russians are forced to go all the way and to take out the Kiev regime, to take Kiev itself, and to have to go all the way to the west just to secure their victory. That's the most likely outcome now. And it's the outcome that the imperialists themselves would prefer. They would prefer to see Ukraine completely and utterly destroyed than to see a deal done. And that is what lies behind the current maneuvers in Kursk. Right. I'm going to go back to the beginning and take in some questions. 279 of you watching at the moment. No, 285 of you watching at the moment. So thank you for that. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. So we have with us tonight Otis, good evening to you. Edward, who says, greetings from the banking colony of Latvia. After the revolution, how can we ensure that the Communist Party isn't taken over by party elites and bureaucrats and later on perform a counter-revolution? Edward, you, I don't know what this is a national characteristic of you Latvians, but you always come in here with the big questions. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just put the ticker on there. So it's because I'm not belittling your question by any means, Edward. This is a question that is interesting, but I want you to email me at the address that's going along the bar at the bottom of the screen, so I can answer this properly. Because it's a question that deserves a much bigger answer than I can give you in the minutes I've got available now. So if you could do that, please, that'd be good. James Graham, good evening. Zauta, good evening to you. Zane Mudassir says, hello, just read the German government will not approve more military aid to Ukraine to reduce federal spending. Yeah, and that's part of the reason why this has happened. Good evening to Sean and Jerry and Tim Gray and Citizen Scriv and Dan Lindstrom and RTB Urgas, good evening to you in Germany. Svetlana joins us from Moscow, who says, comradely greetings from Moscow. Hooked up to Google in China to watch since YouTube is now totally blocked here. Interesting. I saw that the KPRF opposed that blocking of YouTube. I mean, I don't see really what it does. I mean, I can see the point of blocking Facebook and stuff like that, but there's so many ways around this that I just don't see what banning YouTube does for the Russian Federation, to be honest. Edward follows up one question with another and says, how to combat the poisonous petty nationalism that forms tribal and chauvinist gut feelings that capitalists exploit? Well, again, I will come to that question in a future stream, but be sure to email it to me. Arnold, good evening to you. Robert, hello. Luca, good evening. Hello to you out there in Phoenix, Arizona. Tim Gray says the Western media is now claiming the US knew this was planned a year ago, whilst others in the MSM saying it was a UK plan that has pissed off the US. Both wrong, I think, Tim. I think that this, I don't know about planned a year ago. I don't think it was planned that long back. Maybe a few months back. It's what it'll be is, as I said in my opening remarks, it'll be the most aggressive and belligerent sections of the US and British military and intelligence establishments acting together, because there's no clear control over either of them. So both are basically doing what they want. So, or large elements of what they want. So the aim of this is to create the political ground for like full-blown support for Ukraine to continue, or for the war to continue. Elements of the British and the US are both involved with it, but the British will be the ones doing most of the heavy lifting here in terms of planning. The US will stand behind the scenes so they can wash their hands of it if it all goes wrong, which it is, and they'll blame it on the British. Svetlana says, I learned today that over 50 Ukrainian soldiers deserted the night before the incursion in Kursk Oblast, all draftees, of course. Well, good. The more Ukrainians desert, the better. Though I would say that if they desert, they should say that they don't want to be traded. Because if they're traded, they'll just be stuck back on the front line again. You should deny the Kiev regime as much manpower as possible. Grassy Knoll, greetings to you out there in Seattle, Washington. Yuan, in answer to your question, it's desperation and PR moves. Zarg, greetings to you. David King says, could you do a talk on the Bangladesh coup? Here it's to threaten India and Myanmar, plus build a naval base in the Bay of Bengal. I've heard about the motivation of the naval base. I'll have to look into it. It would make sense from the point of view of US imperialism to want a base there, and Bangladesh would be the kind of country where having it there would be strategically useful. Ultimately, the fate of India is no better from the point of view of US imperialism. The fate of India will be the same as that of China and Russia. They don't want India to be able to emerge as a strongly sovereign power. It doesn't matter whether it's run by the BJP and its coalition or Congress and its coalition. The fact that India could escape control of the US and its bloc is enough. So it makes total sense that they would want a naval base in the vicinity, and also that they would have it in Bangladesh rather than Pakistan, which is the relationship with Pakistan is a much more shaky thing than the relationship that they could potentially have with Bangladesh. I mean, they've probably expended their welcome in Pakistan after the last 20 years. We'll see if it happens, though. It's very unfortunate for Bangladeshis if they end up with a colonial military outpost in their country, because that basically means that their independence struggle was, if not for nothing, then it has been severely compromised. Ian Foster, good evening to you, comrade. Greetings to Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk. Lots of social media chat that NATO troops were involved in this attack, says Tim Gray. Well, who's involved will be so-called sheep-dipped personnel from Poland, the United States, Britain, and France, and some other NATO countries as well. There are apparently a number of those countries represented in this raid. I mean, you keep hearing different stories about what the NATO men are doing, that some of them are involved basically running sort of blocking operations so that anytime Ukrainians try to retreat, there's a reliable unit there that will shoot them rather than allow them to retreat. And that is something which is done by essentially mercenaries who are recently left the service of the United States, British, or Polish armies. So we'll see. Yeah, but to answer Tim's question, the nationalities from the NATO bloc are involved in this, but they will be, after Macron's disastrous threats to use French troops, they'll all be, formally speaking, out of the service, out of the direct service of the relevant militaries. Grassy Knoll says, haven't seen Sean Penn in quite a while. Well, I can only assume he's gone to the front line then. Him and Bono leading a suicide squad in the Kursk region, I do hope so. Frank asks, are compradors influencing Iran's response to Israel, or is Iran deliberate and still proceeds according to plan? This is an interesting question from Frank. I don't think so. As such, I mean that the compradors will be affecting it. I think there's a lot of bargaining going on behind the scenes that we're not privy to. I'm told I hear all kinds of things that Iran has decided that they are going to have to engage in a long-term struggle against Israel, some kind of Iranian version of a special military operation against Israel. I'm told that on other days that the Iranians are upping their support to the Iraqis to drive the US out of there, or drive them out of Syria as the priority. I mean, at the moment, it's so up in the air, we don't know. There's all kinds of threats also being made by the imperialists to Iran, which I don't think bothers the Iranians, the Iranian revolutionary wing that much. Could compradors be affecting it? I mean, it's conceivable, but I don't know at this stage. To answer Frank's question, the answer is it's conceivable, but I don't know for certain. Given that even if we take Pezeshkian to be the comprador candidate, he doesn't have control over these elements of policy. And to be honest, he seems a bit of a fucking buffoon. From what I've seen so far, seems to talk a lot of crap and not really know what he's doing. He sort of resembles Pashinyan, but unlike Pashinyan, he doesn't have absolute control over the government. I mean, control over foreign and military policy remains with Khamenei and the IRGC, it seems. Svetlana says Duma in Russian means fort. Kind of funny given the large number of boneheads who sit there. Yeah, not a lot of fort in the Duma, but more than in the British Parliament, it must be said. Right. So, just checking some technical things here. Okay. So, right. Carrying on. Why Ukraine never declared war? Because they were told not to, basically. Don't always say, we should always emphasize the point that the Ukrainians don't make decisions. Not really. For most of what goes on, the Ukrainians are just told what they're doing. Zelenskyy has no real power. Zelenskyy is just pushed around by his handlers. So the reason why they haven't declared war is because it doesn't suit the imperialists that it becomes a formal war, which is why Zelenskyy hasn't done it. Because if it becomes a formal war, then legally speaking, and again, legality be damned in some respects, but the imperialists do want to preserve the appearance of legality. If Ukraine declares war on Russia, that means that essentially what the British, the Americans, the French, and the Germans and the Italians have been doing is aiding one side that is in a state of war. Notice that nobody really likes to declare war anymore. The British didn't do it in the Falklands. There was never a war officially declared against Iraq. There was a UN resolution passed. There was never a war officially declared against Yugoslavia. There was never a war officially declared against Iraq in 2002. I mean, there was an authorization for the invasion, but there wasn't an official declaration of war by the US president, which was put to the US Congress, as far as I remember. All the wars that have happened since then, done by the West, have never involved declarations of war, because a declaration of war involves certain legal parameters being brought in that they want to avoid. So that's why Ukraine hasn't done it, because the imperialists have told them not to. Why are all the Chechens deported under Stalin in 1944? Asks Edward. Well, Chechens and Crimean Tatars were deported because so many of them were aiding the Nazis. To be blunt about it, Edward. That's why it was done. Now, you could say that this was ruthless, that this was too much, but the fact is that because there were so many collaborators popping up in terms of Crimean Tatars and Chechens, that's why the Soviet government, not Stalin, the Soviet government took the decision to remove the populations out to out east, and then they were returned once the war had ended. So, yes, it was an extreme measure, but this was an extreme time when you were getting so many Nazi collaborators turn up from these various different populations that were, in the Chechen case, they were in a very crucial position. You do a mass deportation to get them out of the way, and then you bring them back later. So an extreme measure, yes, but justified by the situation that they were in. But good evening to you. Hugh says, the move into Kursk came from Kiev troops fighting throughout Donbass. If true, doesn't this mean that they have gone from one part of Russia into a less defensible Russian area? Well, the troops that are being used here, well, they come from all over. Some of them came from the Belarus border. Some of them came from around Kiev. And some of them did come from Donbass. So in that sense, the ones that come from Donbass, you make a good point, that yes, they've gone from one part of Russia to another, which is an interesting distinction which some in the Russian information space are talking about, which is that the Russian government, because it's still basically a state of undeclared war in these areas, still doesn't quite, isn't quite living up to its legal obligations with regard to the four areas, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk and Lugansk. Because if there is an attack on Russia, and these areas are now considered Russia, then the Russian Federation is obliged to use, obliged to go into a full-scale war footing, which it largely is in many respects, but still isn't in crucial other respects, such as it's not using conscripted men, apparently, in the forces that are being deployed to the special military operation. So there's some anomalies that come from the incorporation of these four areas into Russia that haven't been resolved yet. So yes, any attack on these four areas is, by the Russian constitution, an attack on the Russian Federation. So all means should be used to defend it, but it's not quite working out that way. These are the contradictions of what the special military operation has created, because it was never meant to be the case originally that any of them would be formally incorporated into Russia. Remember, the Russian government in 2022 wanted the Georgian solution, which is Donetsk and Lugansk basically occupy a sort of a similar position to like South Ossetia or Abkhazia, which is that they're legally within Ukraine. They will be legally within Ukraine, but to all intents and purposes be sort of independent and sort of incorporated with Russia. It will be a sort of legal ambiguity that they would exist in. So this is a fallout from the fact that they declared the special military operation with these rather vague aims, and now they're in a position where they need to essentially evolve this. It's why the KPRF are right to keep putting forward that victory program that they keep bringing up every chance they get, saying, look, the government's still dragging its feet. And they're right. There's still dragging of the feet by the Russian government. The shorthand way of describing it is, oh, Putin's doing this or that. But there's the element, I mean, the dragging of the feet by the Russian government with regard to the economic measures needed, with regard to the fact that comprador elements still sit there in charge of sections of the economy. Not as much as they once did, but they're still there. People like Deripaska are still there. The fact that there had to be armed incursions into Belgorod for the Russian government to actually start the process of training local militias to be able to defend their areas. Again, like they clearly hadn't planned for what this has essentially become, which is a full-scale war in all but name. And there's some elements in the Russian government that clearly don't want it to go any further, but they're going to have to. They're going to have to because, as I've spent some time outlining, the imperialists aren't going to let this go. They're going to keep this war going as long as they possibly can, even though they are restricted in terms of what they can do. They are going to make the Russians pay as much as possible for it. And there's no negotiation. There's no way out of this. Like, certain elements in the Russian government, in the Putin coalition, want to reach a negotiated settlement, but there isn't going to be one. And again, like, you want to turn this into a positive, like, the more that those compromising elements in Russia are weakened, the better. Svetlana says, Yuri Bezmenov was talking nonsense. If anything, it was the USA's own agencies who were undermining American society. Active measures was never part of KGB tactics. Yes. Edward says, the ideological aspect is incredibly important. An example is my nation, the Latvian SSR. Every Latvian relative I have spoken to told me that they listened to Western and, I'm sure your second part will come in just a moment, Latvian USA emigre band music, and my great-grandpa literally listened to the American Voice from Washington, the radio program, every evening, and they worshipped the old bourgeois state of the 20s and 30s, held the old flag and symbols at home, and lived in nostalgia about how the shops always had beautiful dresses and sweets. If you don't mind me asking, Edward, what's the class origin of your relatives and yourself? I'd be interested to know, because I've read about Latvia in the 20s and 30s, and it was for the bulk of the proletariat and peasantry, it was poverty-stricken and backward, and was largely run by German imperialism. So, like, it would be interesting to see, are your relatives and your ancestors, were they from the working class, the peasantry, or were they from the petty bourgeois or bourgeois background? If you can fill us in on that detail, that'd be very interesting. Because, again, I can't see, I mean, but then again, there are those in Russia who are of a similar persuasion. Like, when you look at the progress that the Baltic states made in the socialist period, and you compare it to what happened before and what happened afterwards, the advantages are clear. To me, the only people who would have been nostalgic about the 20s and 30s would have been bourgeois types or petty bourgeois idiots. I mean, I don't mean to throw insults at your relations, Edward. I mean, everyone's got petty bourgeois idiots in his or her family, so don't take it personally. But I'd be interested to know, like, well, what was the basis for your family's nostalgia here? Considering that it's undeniable that the life improved for the bulk of the population in the Baltic states. I know there were political failures by the CPSU, certainly after the Stalin era, that caused the resurgence of petty nationalism. But I'd be interested to see what your response is. Lee, good evening to you. Grassy Knoll says, was Alexei Navalny a Western asset? Undoubtedly he was, Grassy Knoll. he was meant to be included in that prisoner exchange that just took place, which would have all but confirmed his status, which is why I think the British killed him, by the way. Edward says they actively resisted the Soviet states at every step and refused to understand imperialism and capitalism. I'm saddened that the petty bourgeois nationalism never went away. Well, again, I think we have to recall how the Baltic states were incorporated into the Soviet Union originally. I'm sure you're aware of this, Edward. There was a revolutionary process that took place that overthrew the pro-German quasi-fascist regimes in the Baltics, and the Popular Front governments that took power in the Baltic states requested entry or requested that they become constituent parts of the Soviet Union. That's what happened. So there must have been a mass of popular opinion of workers and peasants and some in the petty bourgeois, even in the Baltic states in the late 1930s, who wanted that to happen, and there were many thousands who resisted German occupation as well and paid a heavy price for it. So there would have been, up until the end, pro-socialist Baltic state workers and peasants. The problem was with the Soviet Party that it stopped relying on the masses. It stopped mobilizing the masses. It stopped seeing the need for persistent struggle. And this is where I will perhaps get to answering your question in brief. The realization of Stalin, the realization of Mao, and going back to Lenin as well, that there would need to be, and again, this actually goes all the way back to Marx. The reason for the dictatorship of the proletariat is that the enemies of the revolution will continue to emerge. They will often emerge inside the Communist Party itself even. And when you're in a position as the Soviet Union and the Chinese were in the 1950s, where you're still surrounded by imperialism, or not surrounded by, you're facing off against imperialism. The imperialists are working non-stop to undermine and destroy socialism. Like the preservation and the extension of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the consistent struggle by the party cadres against petty nationalism, against elements of pro-imperialist ideology, against pro-capitalist elements within the party itself. All of that needed to continue and intensify. And you only get to do that properly by educating and mobilizing the masses in the Soviet Union. All of that stopped with Khrushchev. So you're asking, in the 60s, the compradors re-emerged, the counter-revolutionaries re-emerged. So you got like people like Kaja Kallas's father in Estonia, who was like a senior Soviet official for many, many years, immediately defects to the counter-revolution and remains a prominent politician in the 90s in Estonia. This all happened, and it all goes back to Khrushchev essentially defaming stuff of the governing of the country and downplaying the role of the masses and ruling things via bureaucratic fiat. That's what happens. The long-term effects, that's what happens in terms of the cause of the counter-revolution, as we've said many times before. In terms of how you stop it, I will give you basically a very, very quick answer, which is all about a healthy party regime and maintaining that. I think the best thing to do with that, the elaboration that's needed on that question, is to come back to it later in the week. But that's my short answer. Svetlana says, since the start of this special military operation, over 100 big private enterprises have been nationalized in Russia. Sounds good, but reports suggest they are soon to be reprivatized. So, yeah, I keep hearing the same thing. When this comes to an end, and again, it will only come to an end when the Russians force an end to it. There's going to need to be all kinds of reckonings inside Russia itself, and that includes, when we come out of this, there'll probably be an intensified class struggle in Russia, which can only be a good thing, because if there's been a defeat of imperialism, then there needs to be a defeat of imperialism's internal allies in Russia, who are still there and exist principally in the ruling class and the bankrupt, rotten intelligentsia. But yes, I've heard that. I think it's probably time to go back over internal domestic things inside Russia, Svetlana, and I'll do a show on that quite soon. Tim Gray says the UK military have spent way too much time watching dam busters, thinking that won the war, and doing very little time doing a real analysis of what a modern war looks like. I think that their version of a modern war is basically like war by proxy, but yeah, essentially a lot of them are drunk on illusions, though. Zain Mudassir says most working class in Western countries don't believe in their government's warmongering. Many don't, that's true. Just scrolling down. Yours truly says, Alex mentioned on one of these streams that Western cultural propaganda is aimed at students and middle-class professionals. That's always been... Well, the cultural propaganda back in the Cold War was aimed at the intellectuals principally, and winning them over to the cause of imperialism. And it worked to a degree, but only because the Soviet Party made terrible mistakes. Richard Madden asks, what do you think of Kautsky? A dreadful traitor. Worth reading? Not immediately. Prioritize reading other things, Richard. Prioritize reading Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao. And then, once you've read enough of them, go back to Kautsky. It's not that he didn't write some interesting things when he was a revolutionary. It's just that there's far better things that you could be concerning yourself with, to be blunt. Let me just call something up here. Yes. There's a very good reading list which I will recommend to you, which is the Communist Party of Great Britain Marxist-Leninist reading list for home study. And I'm going to post that in the chat, and that's got links to various study resources. So focus on what's in there. Kautsky is a very distant priority. Ocean 2035 on Twitter says the idea that the individual characters within bourgeois parties will bring peace or change things is an illusion, and this is a revisionist slogan leading working class to a dead end. I think is what you're getting at there. Just scrolling down some comments. Edward answers my question, says the great-grandpa who listened to the American voice from Washington was a Lithuanian Pole, dirt poor peasant. His father died as a logger in the 20s, and his mother was also a dirt poor Catholic. Yeah, just goes to show that again, like, if you are not consciously mobilizing the masses into struggle under socialism, then reactionary views will come back. It's only through the class struggle that reactionary views are shed. And the class struggle continues under socialism. And because the Soviets forgot that and neglected that, that's why you end up with people who are dirt poor falling for bullshit. Svetlana answers, my family were dirt poor peasants and still Stalin. Thanks to him, the men studied languages and mathematics and became Red Army officers. No nostalgia for Tsarism in my family. Excellent. Unused sub says, after World War I, the US Department of War drew up War Plan Red, a plan for war with the British Empire. The special relationship is a myth. Yes, they did have a plan for war, but why have a war when you can bankrupt them with loans? Right, moving on. Yeah, it's the usage, the counter-revolutionary trend in the Baltic states is a very curious one. Um, I think it does come down to a couple, like the regrowth of like ultra-reactionary nationalism. It all does stem from the abolition of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the ceasing of the class struggle, and the belief that they could deal with internal problems via administrative measures. Look, the purging of reactionary ideologies, of bourgeois ideology, whether it's liberal or fascist, one does bleed into the other in many countries. Um, that can only be done by, again, mobilizing the masses, educating the masses, um, engaging in struggle, and also clearly identifying internal enemies and external enemies. And it's only by that process that bankrupt ideologies like Latvian or Lithuanian or Estonian petty nationalism are revealed. It's only by engaging in these struggles against them that you comprehensively expose them in front of the masses and reveal their character. That they stopped doing that, and even like the better elements in the CPSU that were there, and there were decent people in the Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian communist parties or sections of the CPSU, they stopped doing that. They became unable to mobilize in a serious way. And this is what led to the fact that these reactionary nationalistic elements that you're talking about, Edward, went unchallenged for decades. Because again, like, you know, Pete, you've all heard me before talk about the Cultural Revolution, but I'll come back to it here again. The Cultural Revolution, for all the flaws that it did have, was very important in several respects. And the important thing that comes out of it for us as people who are learning, communists who are learning about this, is that it showed us that there needs to be at some point there needs to be an ability to bring the masses out into struggle, and to have a, again, like, have the masses engage in struggle even against elements within the party itself if the situation merits it. So if only there had been cadre capable of mobilizing the masses against the reactionaries in the Soviet Union in the 60s or in the 50s, 60s, 70s, then the situation regarding that Gorbachev exploited to drive through the final elements of the counter-revolution could have been avoided. There were enough people in the CPSU right up to the end who did want to preserve the system, but who lacked the ability to mobilize the masses in a serious way, who weren't politically developed enough, who hadn't studied Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and then never mind Mao enough to know how to mobilize the masses and to have the necessary political vision and knowledge to be able to do that in such a way that would defeat the reactionaries, and to be able to identify the reactionaries, because the reactionaries were, if not, they were clearly part of the party and were hiding in plain sight. So for all that the Cultural Revolution got a number of things wrong, at least it showed us a way of actually struggling against the fatal trend of reactionary impulses and tendencies within the Chinese party. If only the Soviets had had a similar thing, you know? And this is something that I think we do need to come back to, and perhaps the way to come back to it is for me to finally do these programs on the Cultural Revolution. There you go, we see. Edward's question has led me to the point where I've realised that I need to do those programs now. So yes, that's something that definitely needs to be come back to. Okay. Grassy Knoll points out that FDR's grandfather Delano made his fortune selling opium to the Chinese during the Opium Wars. A lot of fortunes were made drug dealing. Tim Gray asks, could you cover what happened with the Gang of Four in China as well? Well, Cultural Revolution means that I'm going to have to cover everything from about 65, 66 through till about 1980, when the the reactionary Dengist tendency takes over. But in short, I mean, I've read some of the Gang of Four's writing. I think some of it's very good. They certainly made mistakes, but I agree with certain Maoists who make the claim that who was on trial really in 1980 or so was not the Gang of Four themselves. Who was really on trial was Mao. They didn't. The revisionists in China did not have the strength to do to Mao what Khrushchev did to Stalin. They didn't have the ability to do that. The reputation of Mao was too big. Also, the party, in terms of its revolutionary wing, the revolutionary wing was still powerful, and so a direct assault upon Mao or the entirety of Mao's legacy wasn't possible for Deng Xiaoping or the others, people like Zhao Jiang, to carry through. So what they wanted to do was to essentially sever all of the most revolutionary elements of Mao's legacy. Now, Mao certainly made mistakes. I mean, the whole social imperialism line was a terrible mistake. With regard to the Soviet Union, that was a terrible error. By the way, that error was one that Deng Xiaoping and the 80s leadership continued to make because it enabled them to make nice with US imperialism. That's a fact that some of the Dengists don't really like to talk about. But yes, program on the Cultural Revolution to come, I think, and yes, the fate of the so-called Gang of Four to be explored as well. Probably not this week, probably a couple of weeks' time. I need to finish quite a bit of reading on it. It's been on the back burner for a long time. But yes, that's certainly going to come up. Okay. So, plans for this week upcoming. So tomorrow we have a program on West Asia. That's going to be coming up tomorrow at 4. And then Tuesday, 7:30, back here again for the latest in the Stalin series. Those are the next two programs we've got coming up. I'm going to draw things to a close for this evening. So thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and on Buy Me a Coffee. Your support is what makes this possible. And the audio versions of the latest programs will be going up on Patreon today and tomorrow. Thanks to everybody who has come onto the program tonight. Thanks to everybody who's contributed to the chat. I'll be back with you again tomorrow, but until then, have a good evening.